You were told it was just a myth, a poetic symbol, an image painted on sarcophagi and scrawled into ancient scrolls. But what if it wasn't? What if the weighing of the heart wasn't a metaphor for morality, but a real trial with real stakes, real verdicts, and real consequences, not in life, but in death? Imagine this: a courtroom beneath a temple, candles flickering against sandstone walls, where a heart is measured not by weight, but by truth. And the sentence: total annihilation of the soul. Not punishment, erasure, no afterlife, no memory. Just gone. Let that thought settle in your chest, like dust in a tomb. Breathe slow. The ancients didn't speak of death as an end. They whispered of judgment. And the ritual they envisioned was not merely symbolic, it might have been disturbingly literal. Somewhere deep in the folds of Egyptian myth lies a ritual older than the pyramids. A ceremony both beautiful and terrifying. The heart, the seat of the soul, placed upon a scale. Opposite it, a feather, just one, plucked from the wing of the goddess Mayat, the embodiment of truth and balance. If your heart was heavier, corrupted by lies or sin, it was devoured, not punished, consumed, by a creature made from nightmares, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, a myth, the devourer. But what if this wasn't just a tale told to keep children from lying? What if in dark chambers behind temple doors, the ritual was enacted ceremonially, politically, or both on the newly dead or on the living, condemned by unseen laws? You are about to step into a world of cryptic texts, forgotten rituals, and quiet judgments whispered through stone. This is not the story you read in school. It is older, stranger, and perhaps truer than we were ever meant to believe. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. It always begins with a scroll. Not one neatly preserved behind museum glass, but a fragile, cracking papyrus found curled inside a painted coffin, its ink faded but not silenced. These scrolls, misleadingly labeled books of the dead, were not books in any conventional sense. They were spells, instructions, and pleas stitched together across centuries, each meant to guide a soul through the perilous landscape of the afterlife. And nestled within them, among invocations and charms, was one passage that scholars have returned to with obsessive frequency: Spell 125. You've seen the images. The jackal-headed Anubis adjusting the scale, Thoth poised to record the verdict, and Ammit crouched nearby like a celestial bailiff with an appetite. But the real mystery isn't in the art, it's in the words. Spell 125 doesn't merely describe a weighing, it performs it. The soul speaks. It proclaims its innocence across 42 declarations, one for each assessor deity. I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not caused pain. I have not polluted the water. And on it goes a cosmic litany of moral accounting. But why such specificity? Why the precise phrasing? And why, if this was all metaphor, did the spell follow such a rigid protocol, name, denial, outcome, as though transcribed from an actual courtroom proceeding? Some Egyptologists suggest the spell's structure mirrors the format of judicial trials in ancient Egypt, particularly those from the Middle Kingdom onward. Courts were convened, witnesses testified, priests acted as scribes and judges, and just as in Spell 125, individuals stood to defend themselves against allegations, sometimes during life, sometimes it seems after death. The Papyrus of Ani, perhaps the most famous version of the Book of the Dead, features this sequence front and center, as though Ani himself wanted the performance of judgment to be unmistakable, not metaphorical, literal. And that brings us to a rather inconvenient hypothesis. What if this wasn't just a vision of the soul's journey, but a record of a ritual trial, one that could have taken place physically as a ceremony in temple precincts? There are whispers in archaeological reports, unconfirmed scattered notes of funerary papyri being found not in tombs, but within the walls of temple complexes, suggesting they may have been used in something more performative than burial preparation. One rare inscription from the tomb of Nebseni, a Theban scribe, reads, "He who passes through the judgment unweighed shall not rise again." That line has puzzled translators. Why unweighed? Why was not being weighed? Worse than failing. Among fringe researchers, yes, the kind that make conventional Egyptologists sigh audibly, there are those who argue that spell 125 was once enacted theatrically, perhaps during elaborate funerary rites, with priests assuming the roles of gods, the deceased represented by effigies, and the heart real or symbolic, placed upon a scale in full view of mourners. Performance, yes, but also judgment. Mainstream scholars tend to recoil from this suggestion, favoring a purely spiritual interpretation. But even they admit the structure of Spell 125 feels procedural, almost bureaucratic. Which leads to a larger question: who wrote these spells, and more importantly, who enforced them? Recall from our opening the possibility that this was more than myth. Spell 125 may have been a codified system, a divine constitution disguised as liturgy. It outlines not just moral laws, but the process for contesting them. It names the judges, it defines the punishments, and it leaves little room for creative interpretation. This is where our quiet mystery starts to raise its voice. Could an ancient civilization have believed so strongly in justice after death that it reenacted it on Earth? Could temples have doubled as metaphysical courtrooms where souls were judged not in theory, but in spectacle? Even more unsettling is this: if Spell 125 was used ritually, it may have served political purposes. Imagine a royal funeral where the weighing of the heart becomes a public declaration of the pharaoh's purity, or a tool to shame his enemies. A sacred verdict with consequences not only for the dead, but for the living lineage. And here lies the contradiction scholars still wrestle with. If the spell was purely symbolic, why did it follow such judicial structure? And if it wasn't symbolic, then what have we misunderstood for the past 3,000 years? A feather, a heart, and a scale. Not symbols, instruments. And Spell 125, perhaps, was never a story to be read, but a ritual to be seen. Beneath the layers of sand and time, the goddess Ma'at does not shimmer like the sun gods or roar like Set. She is quieter, more abstract, and yet her influence ran deeper than any deity whose face adorned temple walls. With her single feather of truth, Ma'at governed not just the afterlife, but the very notion of order. She wasn't a goddess in the way most were imagined. Ma'at was a principle. Cosmic balance, justice, harmony. She was the reason the Nile flowed and the stars moved in rhythm. Without her, there was only Isfet chaos, which in ancient Egyptian thought wasn't merely bad, it was fatal. But here's the rub. While many accept Ma'at as the ideal of moral and universal equilibrium, fewer have dared to explore what that ideal looked like in practice. And what they've found is oddly bureaucratic, legalistic even. Ma'at wasn't just carved onto tombs, she was carried into court. Historical records from the Old and Middle Kingdoms describe pharaohs living by Ma'at and judging with her. Judicial papyri contain oaths sworn by Ma'at. Even viziers, the kingdom's top officials, were expected to wear the image of Ma'at around their necks as a badge of office. That's not spiritual metaphor, that's procedural expectation. In one particularly well-preserved fragment from the tomb of Rekhmir the Vizier under Thutmose III, a list of judicial duties is outlined in excruciating detail. Rekhmir is instructed to judge the people, do justice, support the righteous, and punish the wrongdoer so that Ma'at may endure, not just in the cosmos, in paperwork, trials, tax receipts. So when we look again at the weighing of the heart, we begin to see not just a spiritual judgment, but a reenactment of the actual legal system. The court of the gods mirrored the courts of the Nile. The 42 assessors who hear the soul's protestations in Spell 125 scholars now compare them to the provincial governors or nomarchs who would have served as regional judges. The scale is not merely symbolic, it's a legal tool. This raises uncomfortable questions. Was the entire mythology of the afterlife built on the scaffolding of actual courtroom procedures? Were priests not just spiritual guides, but state prosecutors? And were verdicts rendered in these imagined realms used to validate or condemn someone's memory in the real world? One obscure reference, often overlooked, appears in the Papyrus Abbot, a document detailing tomb inspections in the Valley of the Kings during the 20th dynasty. In it, an official condemns a tomb robber not only for stealing goods, but for bringing Isfet upon the bones of the dead. That phrase is chilling. Not stealing, not sacrilege, but Isfet cosmic disorder. The criminal, it implies, disrupted Ma'at, and in doing so had his own name condemned erased from the official record. No tomb, no ceremony, no afterlife, in every meaningful sense unmade. Call back now to Spell 125. To that line from Nebseni, he who passes through the judgment unweighed shall not rise again. If Ma'at was the legal code, then the weighing was the court. And if you weren't judged, you weren't absolved. If you weren't absolved, you simply didn't exist anymore. Yet this line of thinking isn't without its detractors. Some modern scholars argue the weighing scene is purely didactic, a moral compass, not a legal template. They remind us that Egyptian theology was inherently poetic. That myth bled into ritual, which bled into art, which bled into daily life, until nothing could be entirely teased apart. A valid point. But then again, when was poetry ever this procedural? Even the artwork reinforces the tension between ideal and practice. In tomb after tomb, we see scales meticulously depicted, with chords, pegs, even counterweights, suggesting that their artists understood the mechanics of balance in a literal sense. Not just as a metaphor, but as an apparatus. The feather isn't floating, it's resting. The heart isn't pulsing with symbolic regret, it's carved, weighed, and recorded. And so we arrive at an uneasy crossroads. If Ma'at was law and the weighing was court, then the boundary between religion and government in ancient Egypt may not have been a boundary at all. It may have been a stage, and those who stood upon it, priests, scribes, mourners, were not only participants in a spiritual drama, but witnesses to a legal reckoning. In this view, Ma'at was less a goddess than a constitution. The weighing of the heart was not only mythic justice, it was precedent. And precedent once established tends to linger, in rituals, in laws, in collective memory. Which begs the question, who decided when the scales were truly balanced? There is a particular silence that lives inside Egyptian tombs. Not the silence of age or abandonment, but the kind that was placed there deliberately, like a warning left to echo in stone. You feel it not in your ears, but in your chest, a tightness, a whisper that doesn't quite say words, but still communicates something clear. Tread carefully. These were not places simply meant to rest the dead. They were statements, vaults of narrative, legal documents in a way chiseled into walls and sealed in darkness. The tomb inscriptions, so often skipped over in favor of more colorful murals, hold some of the oldest surviving declarations of innocence in the ancient world. "I was a man who walked in my at," one says. Another, "I caused no tears. I took no bread unjustly. I gave water to the thirsty." These are not poetic flourishes. They are structured, repetitive, and most notably defensive. Why such defensive writing in the home of the dead? The answer may lie in the belief that death was not the end of accountability. In fact, it may have been its beginning. While the living had some power to rewrite their legacy, the dead had only their tombs. The inscriptions served as testimony declarations to unseen judges. And when read aloud by the living priest's family or even tomb robbers, they activated that testimony like a spell. In this sense, the tomb became a courtroom, the inscriptions a kind of affidavit. One phrase appears again and again: "Do not speak falsehood against me in the place of judgment." Not "do not lie," but "do not lie about me." It's almost paranoid in tone, as if the soul feared posthumous defamation, feared that even after death, enemies might bring accusations that could tip the balance of the scale. And considering how politically fraught many of these tombs are, scribes rising beyond their rank, priests nudging out rivals, maybe that fear wasn't paranoia at all. Maybe it was foresight. The language of fear wasn't always subtle either. Some tombs featured literal curses, not poetic curses, but threats carved with bluntness that borders on bureaucratic. "He who defiles this tomb shall lose his lineage. His heart shall be devoured. His name shall be unspoken." Not merely a warning, but a judgment rendered in advance. This is where the tension sharpens. If the soul feared being judged after death, and if that judgment had consequences, annihilation, oblivion, social erasure, then these inscriptions weren't simply decorative. They were preventative, protective, legal. And here again we see echoes of Spell 125. The same declarations, the same order, the same weight. But the implications run deeper when we consider how some of these tombs were constructed. Certain elites included entire false doors in their burial chambers, architectural features meant to allow the soul's vital essence, to pass through and receive offerings. But more than that, they acted like symbolic courthouses. The deceased would sit in judgment not only by gods, but by visitors. And each visitor, knowingly or not, became part of the process. Reading the inscriptions, speaking the names, offering food, or neglecting it, all actions that could help or harm the soul's eternal verdict. An obscure but intriguing case emerges from the tomb of Kayamwaset, a prince and priest of the 19th dynasty, whose tomb shows exceptional complexity in its inscriptions. One passage hints at a trial after death, complete with a plea to future priests to read the proper rites, lest my judgment be incomplete. Why would judgment need updating? Was there a belief that verdicts could be revisited? Retrials in the afterlife? Modern Egyptologists still debate whether such inscriptions were sincere expressions of belief or simply funerary traditions copied out of habit. But that argument misses the point. Whether or not the ancient writers believed in the literal consequences, the inscriptions were crafted to persuade someone, if not the gods, then the people. And if belief was widespread enough, who's to say these writings didn't carry real legal weight? A curse read aloud might reinforce a family's claim to land. A moral declaration might sway a priestly council deciding whether a deceased man's heirs could inherit his estate. Which leads us back to Ma'at. These inscriptions are not quiet prayers. They're arguments, not to the gods alone, but to anyone who might come after. The fear etched into tomb walls wasn't just spiritual dread, it was fear of legal consequence, of the soul being judged not on the scale, but by society, of being declared unjust, of being forgotten. And so the dead spoke through stone, desperately trying to tip the scale in their favor. Whether they were innocent or not, they wanted the record to say they were. You imagine tombs as final destinations, a carved sarcophagus sealed beneath tons of stone, a quiet end to a noisy life. But in Egypt, some of the most sacred rituals did not happen inside tombs at all. They happened before burial, in secret, in places few ever saw, perhaps even in rooms whose purpose has been misidentified or deliberately obscured. Across temple complexes from Abydos to Karnak, archaeologists have found chambers that defy easy explanation. Small, windowless, accessible only through twisting corridors or elevated platforms. Some contain benches arranged in semicircles, others show worn floors as if from repeated processions. These are not burial chambers, nor are they storage rooms. A few feature offering tables, while others bear traces of incense burn and polished stone smoothed by centuries of footsteps or knees. Their purpose remains a matter of debate, but a quiet theory has emerged among certain scholars. These may have been the ritual spaces where the weighing of the heart was enacted not metaphorically, but symbolically performed by priests during the funerary process. Not every burial, of course. Only the elite, the powerful, those whose fates mattered beyond their own soul. The idea seems outrageous at first. Why would anyone stage a trial for the dead but consider the stakes? If Ma'at governed not just the cosmos but political legitimacy, then proving someone had passed her test served more than a religious function. It was a public confirmation of justice, a final stamp on their legacy, or a condemnation to be whispered behind veils. One narrow hallway in the temple of Seti Thamo at Abydos leads to a chamber with no obvious ceremonial function. Yet the walls depict purification scenes, priests washing statues, offerings carried in procession, and one curious image, a heart-shaped object placed before a seated figure beside what might be a feather. The symbolism is unmistakable, but there's no accompanying inscription to explain it, as though the ritual was known well enough not to require words, or perhaps forbidden to name. In some temple precincts, floor plans resemble miniature versions of the Hall of Two Truths, the mythological space where the weighing takes place in the afterlife. Could this be coincidence, perhaps? But the Egyptians were famously consistent in their spatial metaphors. Temples mirrored the cosmos. Sacred geography was not decoration, it was doctrine. If the weighing occurred in myth, it was natural to echo it in stone. This possibility gains weight, no pun intended, when we examine funerary rites recorded on papyri. In the opening of the mouth ceremony performed to restore a corpse's ability to eat, speak, and defend itself, there are curious phrases. May your voice rise in the tribunal of Osiris. May your heart speak truth before the balance. These are courtroom terms, and the ritual itself involves priests taking on roles. One holds the censer, one speaks for the dead, one holds a blade, another a feather fan. It's a performance, a reenactment, and quite possibly a judgment. Recall the earlier inscriptions that pleaded for posthumous fairness, that warned future generations not to speak falsely of the dead. Now imagine that anxiety resolved through ceremony. Imagine priests garbed in white linen chanting the soul's defense in a chamber designed to resemble the afterlife's courtroom. Imagine a symbolic scale raised from bronze, a feather placed with reverence, a heart real or sculpted set beside it. Not for gods, for witnesses. Some rare New Kingdom tomb illustrations depict the weighing scene not as a myth, but as an event watched by human onlookers, priests, scribes, and in one case a figure who appears to be a living relative. If these depictions reflect practice, not fantasy, then it suggests the possibility of ritual trials held for the recently deceased, where the judgment scene was dramatized for the benefit of the community. Which leads to an uncomfortable thought. What if these rites were not just meant to honor the dead, but to assess their right to be honored? In a society obsessed with name preservation, a negative verdict could mean the soul was denied offerings, excluded from prayers, even stricken from temple records. That's not superstition. That's political fallout. And in a few controversial cases, archaeologists have found sealed-off chambers containing incomplete burial assemblages, coffins without names, statues without inscriptions, tombs begun but never finished. Some speculate these belong to individuals whose judgment was quite literally interrupted. Rituals abandoned. Legacy withheld. Of course, such theories invite skepticism. There are no direct records confirming that the weighing was physically enacted as part of funeral rites. But the circumstantial evidence is growing rooms that echo myth rituals, that mimic court proceedings, and inscriptions that sound more like closing arguments than prayers. It's as though the ancient Egyptians, while preparing the dead for eternity, also prepared their reputations for inspection, and sometimes for rejection. The Egyptian priesthood was not a quiet order of isolated mystics. They were administrators, legal officers, estate managers, doctors, astronomers, and perhaps most powerfully, judges. But the title priest may be misleading. It evokes a figure bowed in reverence, whispering prayers into silence. In Egypt, it also meant control. Over ritual, over law, over who was remembered and who was erased. At the heart of the weighing of the heart lies a judgment, and judgments require judges. While the mythological tribunal is populated with gods, Thoth, Osiris, the 42 assessors, it's the priesthood who in life ensured that these divine rituals were mirrored on earth. In the real world, they held the scales. Historical records from the Middle Kingdom onward reveal that priests regularly presided over legal disputes. In many cases, the lines between temple authority and state authority are almost impossible to define. A priest might oversee a land inheritance by day, recite incantations over a corpse by dusk, and act as a legal witness before the sun rose again. They were everywhere, anchoring not only the spiritual structure of Egypt, but its legal and social fabric. Consider the case of the temple at Medinet Habu. It wasn't merely a place of worship, it functioned as a tax collection center, judicial court, and local administrative hub. Priests kept ledgers, priests conducted audits, and when disputes arose, it was the priests who settled them. But what's particularly relevant here is the temple's mortuary function. Priests assigned to these complexes handled not only the physical body of the deceased, but the rites that secured their place in the afterlife. And as we've already seen, some of those rites bear remarkable resemblance to legal proceedings. This dual-function ritual and legal raises an unsettling possibility. If priests judged the dead symbolically in rituals and the living in courts, then perhaps the line between those roles was thinner than we imagined. Perhaps the weighing wasn't just mimed for the gods. Perhaps it was interpreted, evaluated, even decided by men. Let's recall a fragment from the tomb of the priest Padiamanope, whose writings describe his role as one who understands the weighing of words. This isn't an abstract title, it's a legal one. In ancient Egyptian courts, testimony was often described as weighing the words of the accused. The same phrasing used in descriptions of the heart's judgment. Coincidence, possibly. But when language overlaps that specifically, it starts to look like policy. And here's where things turn sharper. There are rare funerary papyri, obscure, brittle things almost forgotten in museum archives that suggest the priest not only conducted rites for the dead, but made decisions about their outcome. One damaged text refers to the scroll of reversal, a ritual meant to reverse misdeeds in life, to ensure the heart would pass the weighing. But the ritual required approval. A priest had to grant it, not the gods, a priest. This idea unsettles the romantic view of Egyptian spirituality. We want to believe the gods held the final say. But what if it was always the priest's mortal political fallible who decided whose heart was light enough to pass? What if the weighing was as much an earthly judgment as a cosmic one? And as always, power corrupts. If a priest-judge held sway over the verdict of a soul, imagine the leverage. A well-placed donation might ensure favorable prayers. A rival's name could be quietly excluded from the scrolls. A family's honor preserved or shattered, depending on a priest's whispered verdict during the weighing ceremony. The ritual could be manipulated, the scale unbalanced, before it was even raised. Of course, not all priests were political animals. Many were likely sincere in their duties. But sincerity doesn't prevent systems from being used, especially when the public couldn't see behind the veil. To the average Egyptian, the priesthood was sacred, their authority unquestionable. But to those inside the system, the weighing might have been less about truth and more about who controlled the narrative. And that brings us back to Ma'at. She was not a goddess of vengeance or wrath. She was balance. But balance in human hands is fragile. Tilt it slightly, and the outcome changes. Make the feather a fraction heavier. Interpret a declaration differently. Choose silence instead of recitation. The gods might remain pure, but their rituals mediated by men were vulnerable. One particularly eerie case comes from a tomb in Saqqara, where a priest was buried with multiple heart scarabs. Most individuals had one inscribed with a prayer from spell 30b meant to silence the heart's testimony. But this priest had 5, each carved differently. Some scholars think they were experimental hedging bets. Others wonder if he was worried. Perhaps he had reason to believe that when the scale was raised, his own kind would not show mercy. You might recall from earlier the curse inscriptions, the pleas for fairness, the inscriptions begging future generations not to alter the verdict. Now they echo with new weight. If priests held the power to shape a soul's judgment, then the greatest fear wasn't the gods. It was the judges themselves. They look small in museum cases, less than the size of a clenched fist, often green or blue, shaped like beetles, and carved with lines that seem decorative at first glance. But these were not trinkets. They were heart scarabs, and to the ancient Egyptians, they were tools of survival. Not survival in this life, but in the next. And perhaps, if certain theories prove true, they were more than charms. They were early instruments of narrative control designed to tamper with divine justice in its most vulnerable moment. The idea seems outrageous. How could an amulet interfere with the judgment of gods? But we must remember, the Egyptians believed words had power. To write something down was to summon its essence. And on the underside of these scarabs always was a spell. Specifically, spell 30b from the Book of the Dead. Its message is both chilling and oddly desperate. Do not stand as a witness against me. Do not oppose me in the tribunal. Do not tip the balance. It's not addressed to a god. It's addressed to the heart. In Egyptian belief, the heart wasn't just a symbol of emotion. It was the record of the soul. It remembered everything. Every lie, every kindness, every betrayal. And when judgment came, the heart testified. That's what made the weighing so dangerous. You couldn't charm a god, but you might be able to silence your own heart. Enter the scarab. Made often from green feldspar or steatite, heart scarabs were placed over the chest of the deceased, sometimes inside the wrappings, other times directly over the heart. Many are engraved with the full spell 30B, but some are more elaborate. One scarab found in the tomb of a Theban official includes an extra line, "Let me rise in the sunboat of Ra." This wasn't just a plea for silence. It was a negotiation. You begin to see the implications. If the heart could betray you, and if a scarab could stop it, then these amulets became a kind of legal override, a last-minute appeal before sentencing. A mute button for guilt. And like any good piece of legal strategy, it was only available to those who could afford it. Poorer burials rarely include scarabs, but elites. They had them in multiples, some wrapped in gold leaf, others set with lapis lazuli. One high priest was buried with a scarab that included his entire career history, written in microscopic hieroglyphs, as if to overwhelm the scale with positive PR. Another was shaped like a heart itself scarab and symbol fused into one. A replacement organ with a pre-approved message. This returns us to the issue of control. If judgment was inevitable, then preparation became paramount. The scarab wasn't just protection, it was persuasion. A way to steer the verdict. And if you recall our earlier exploration of the priesthood's legal role, you'll see how these tools could be part of a broader ecosystem. The priests wrote the spells. They oversaw the burial. They ensured the scarab was placed correctly. Was it a safeguard or a service? One particularly obscure scarab, housed in a lesser-known European collection, bears no spell at all, but instead a miniature depiction of the weighing scene itself. In the image, the heart and feather appear balanced, but Anubis's hand is suspiciously close to the scale. Is it a prayer for fairness or a request for assistance? Scholars remain divided. Some view the scarabs as devotional objects, spiritual aids to help the soul stay focused. Others suggest they were a workaround, a metaphysical loophole to soften divine judgment. And then there are those who argue the scarabs may have had a secondary function, as legal declarations of moral status, not unlike passports. Found with the body inscribed with the deceased's virtues, they could be presented not only to gods, but to priests, mourners, or future judges reviewing one's legacy. And in a strange echo of our earlier discussions, we find callbacks again and again to the concept of silencing. In spell 125, the soul must speak. In spell 30B, the heart must not. It's a tension that suggests a deeper anxiety. What if, when the time came, your own body betrayed you? What if your heart remembered something inconvenient? In that context, the scarab becomes less a symbol of belief and more a preemptive legal maneuver. The ancient equivalent of a posthumous lawyer buried on your chest, whispering, "Say nothing. Let me handle this." The very existence of these amulets implies that judgment, even divine judgment, could be influenced. That the system, whether mythic or real, had vulnerabilities, and those who knew how to exploit them might secure a kind of afterlife immunity. Of course, such interpretations aren't universally accepted. Many scholars insist the scarabs were purely devotional, comforting rituals, rather than manipulative tools. But when you examine the care, the precision, the urgency with which they were used, it's hard not to sense a deeper game at play. Because in the end, if the weighing was truly incorruptible, there would be no need to silence the heart. Beneath the grand narratives and polished myths, history leaves behind its marginalia, scraps of forgotten papyri, unfinished records, and misfiled scrolls. These are not the kinds of documents tourists come to see, but they are often the most revealing, and within these lesser-known texts, a strange and persistent thread emerges. A thread that suggests that the dead in ancient Egypt were not always left alone. Some were brought to judgment not just symbolically, but formally, legally, publicly, long after their hearts had stopped beating. It begins with the papyrus Salt 124, an administrative record from the 20th dynasty. On its face, it's a dry bureaucratic document, a report on tomb robberies and the investigation that followed. But buried within its columns is an odd detail. One of the accused, a man named Hu, is reported to have stolen amulets from the tomb of a high priest. What stands out is not the theft, but the punishment. Hui was sentenced not only to death, but to having his name removed from public records and his family denied access to ancestral tombs. Why such severity? Perhaps because the crime wasn't merely theft. It was spiritual contamination, an offense against the dead that, according to one rare line, required a balancing in the halls of silence. That phrasing appears nowhere else in known texts. Some believe it was a poetic flourish. Others think it may refer to a formal posthumous proceeding where the soul of the violated was symbolically weighed again as if to repair the damage. This idea of revisiting judgment, of retrying the dead, seems to echo through other obscure papyri. The papyrus Bulaq 18 contains a curious entry, "Let his name be brought forth to judgment, that the balance may be tested again." The subject, a scribe accused of falsifying temple records, who had died before trial. The priesthood, rather than dismiss the case, continued it. His scrolls were examined, his offerings denied. And at some point, though the papyrus is damaged, his name disappears from the temple's donor rolls. You might recall from earlier chapters the chilling fear voiced in tomb inscriptions, "Do not speak, lies about me after death." Now it seems that fear was justified, because in some cases the dead could be reaccused. Retrials were not metaphors, they were mechanisms, social tools for correcting legacy or revoking honor. One particularly controversial text, the so-called Scroll of the Unworthy, was found in fragments near Deir el-Medina. It appears to be a list of individuals whose tombs had been desecrated intentionally. Not by robbers, but by decree. The list is headed by a phrase, "those whose hearts were found heavy after the burial." Were these executions of legacy, judicial excommunications, or just cautionary tales? We may never know. Still, a pattern emerges. And as always, the priesthood looms large. It was they who administered these posthumous reckonings, who read the rituals, examined the records, interpreted the behavior of the deceased, not as history, but as evidence. It's tempting to see this as a spiritual continuation of legal justice, but it may also have been something more pragmatic, a way to shape memory, to reward loyalty, punish betrayal, and remind the living that death did not end accountability. Imagine for a moment a rival power faction in Thebes uncertain about the legacy of a former vizier. His burial had been lavish, his tomb full of offerings. But politically, his memory was inconvenient. The priesthood, with enough pressure, might reopen his record, conduct a ritual weighing, declare him found wanting, his heart symbolic now too heavy, his name struck from the books, his statues defaced. Not in rage, but in solemn ceremony. You've seen this kind of erasure before. The face of Hatshepsut chiseled from stone. Akhenaten's temples dismantled, his name scraped from walls. These weren't acts of vandalism. They were verdicts, final judgments. Not just political corrections, but spiritual condemnations, trials held in silence under the pretense of cosmic justice. And it's here that the callback to earlier rituals becomes stark. The ceremony of the weighing was no longer just for the deceased. It became a posthumous tool, whether to cleanse a soul, condemn it, or rewrite its place in history. And the criteria were fluid. Interpretations of Ma'at could shift. New rulers could demand new truths. Justice, eternal though it claimed to be, was still vulnerable to earthly hands. Even today, the ruins echo with ambiguity. A tomb once believed to belong to a revered noble might later be found stripped of its name. A funerary mask carefully restored reveals alterations made long after burial. These are not just signs of looting. They are corrections, revisions, quiet verdicts passed by those who survived. It raises a final, disquieting thought. If the dead could be retried, if legacy could be revoked, then perhaps the real scale never stopped moving. Perhaps it still tilts ever so slightly, depending on who holds the feather. It's tempting to think of the weighing of the heart as something that happened once long ago, far removed from the world of dusty courtrooms and political maneuvering. A symbolic end sealed in myth. But what if it was never meant to be a static story? What if it was always evolving, shifting quietly from spiritual metaphor to procedural ritual, and finally to a tool of narrative power? And what if buried beneath the sand and poetry, the weighing of the heart wasn't just a judgment of the soul, but a real-world trial carried out with careful deliberation? We have followed the threads, from the rigid structure of Spell 125 to the physical design of temple chambers, from the inscriptions that read like legal declarations to the priesthood's dual role as spiritual guide and legal authority, from the crafted silence of heart scarabs to the troubling idea of posthumous condemnation. And now, with the pieces before us, a theory takes shape. What if the weighing of the heart was not merely an idea, but a judicial model, a framework that operated both in the world of the gods and in the practical mechanisms of society? A kind of sacred jurisprudence enacted not just in belief, but in performance, in policy, in stone. To understand the scale of that possibility, consider again how embedded Ma'at was in all aspects of life. She governed not only morality, but the alignment of institutions. Judges were expected to act in Ma'at, not just in theory, but in documented, enforceable behavior. Justice was not abstract. It was the very condition of continued existence. Without it, the Nile would not rise. The sun would not return. Pharaohs were described as living in Ma'at, not because they were good people, but because order was their currency. And where there is order, there is judgment. And where there is judgment, there is power. The weighing then becomes more than ritual, it becomes protocol, perhaps once enacted in full ceremonial form for kings' high priests or officials whose legacy demanded validation. Perhaps also for political ends where verdicts could cleanse or condemn the dead before the living. The performance mattered. The symbolism was never just metaphor, it was infrastructure. Recall again the small chambers beneath temples, their geometry echoing the Hall of Two Truths. The benches worn down not by time, but by repetition. These were not tombs. They were stages, perhaps used to rehearse justice, perhaps used to declare it. In one little-known funerary stela from the Third Intermediate Period, an official's son writes, "My father was found true of voice before the great balance. Let no man speak otherwise, or the gods will remember." A strange phrasing. The son isn't appealing to divine mercy, he's warning others not to contradict an official verdict. It reads less like theology and more like a ruling. Final, enforceable. In such a system, death becomes a transition, not into oblivion, but into the final and most consequential trial. One where reputation, memory, and divine favor were all weighed together. And perhaps this trial was not merely conducted in the metaphysical, perhaps it was codified, enacted, measured, with witnesses, with performance, with a verdict passed not in myth but in ritual chambers whose purpose still confounds archaeologists. And if that is true, if the weighing of the heart functioned as a real-world judgment, then every element we've explored, becomes evidence in a case far larger than one soul's fate. The scarabs, legal protections, the inscriptions, testimonies, the priesthood prosecutors and defenders. The performance A court masquerading as a funeral. Even the gods may have served less as deities in this model and more as symbolic stand-ins for real institutional roles. Thoth, the scribe, mirrors the human scribes who documented temple proceedings. Osiris, the ruler of the dead, reflects the authority of the state. And Anubis, the embalmer and balancer, echoes the officiants who physically prepared the body and perhaps its defense. This reading may be uncomfortable. It unspools the beauty of the myth and replaces it with something colder, a system, a process. But beauty and process are not mutually exclusive. And in Egypt, where death was never the end, but a negotiation, it makes a kind of sense. Of course, the afterlife would be legalistic. Of course, ritual would double as verdict. And here is where we must return to Ma'at. She was not vengeance, not punishment. She was balance. But balance, when applied by people, becomes a decision, and decisions can be swayed. So perhaps the weighing of the heart wasn't a test you could pass or fail by divine measure alone. Perhaps it was a performance you survived by convincing the right people, living or dead, that your heart was light enough. And if that's true, then the most important ritual in Egyptian belief was never about death. It was about proof. So much of ancient Egypt has crumbled, sand devours, stone names fade from papyri, even gods lose their worshippers. And yet the image of the scale remains. Balanced, quiet, eternal. The feather of Ma'at on one side, a human heart on the other. It endures not because of its antiquity, but because of its simplicity, its symmetry, its terrifying elegance. We are not so different now. We still measure lives, not with feathers or scarabs perhaps, but in obituaries, in headlines, in quiet conversations after funerals. We still ask the same questions. The ancient Egyptians built an entire civilization around, was this person good? Were they fair? Do they deserve to be remembered? And though we no longer believe in crocodile-headed monsters or posthumous trials behind temple doors, we do still hold our own versions of judgment. Institutions hand down rulings long after someone has passed. Public opinion revises legacies. We canonize, we cancel, we weigh. Quietly, endlessly, we weigh. What the weighing of the heart offered was not just comfort, it was accountability. A reminder that no action, however small, went unnoticed. That the soul kept its own records. That even if you escaped justice in life, there might be justice in death. It's an idea both frightening and strangely merciful that the universe might remember what we wish to forget. Perhaps that's why the image persists, not just in hieroglyphs, but in our imagination, a scale, a verdict, a single moment where everything is made clear. And maybe that's what the ancients hoped for most. Not absolution, but clarity. A chance to be seen for who they were completely and still find balance. So as the sands shift and the stars return to their nightly rhythm over the ruins, the silence is not empty. It whispers of judgment, of memory, of hearts still waiting to be weighed. Sleep now, traveler. Let your heart rest light. You are, after all, still writing your own verdict.